Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're exploring Bushido, a concept that often brings to mind these powerful swordsmen, unwavering commitment, and a strict set of rules, the way of the warrior.
Right.
At its heart, Bushido, literally translated, emphasizes martial skill, profound loyalty, especially to one's lord, and a powerful sense of honor among the pre-modern Japanese samurai.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit because the popular image, it only really scratches the surface. Bushido wasn't some static set of commandments handed down. It shifted and changed, sometimes quite a bit, across different eras and even different samurai clans. They had varied interpretations of its core principles.
So the romanticized version we often see is just one part of it.
Exactly, one facet of a much richer and frankly more complex history.
And that complexity is really what we want to dive into today. Our mission, if you will, is to trace this multifaceted history.
Where's might have started in feudal Japan?
Yeah, its potential origins, the key philosophical influences like Zen Buddhism, Confucianism, Shinto, that really shaped it.
The core virtues it encompassed.
Right, and the fascinating scholarly debates around its authenticity, its development. And then we'll look at its transformation after the samurai era, post-Meiji Restoration.
And how it still impacts Japan today. Business, education.
Social norms, martial arts, even national identity, it's quite far-reaching.
What's really fascinating here, I think, is this fundamental tension.
Go on.
Well, Bushido was undeniably linked to the lived experiences, the ethical choices of samurai for centuries. That's real.
Sure.
Yet it also sort of evolved into this actively constructed idea, particularly after the Meiji period. That's when the focus of loyalty really shifted, right? Towards the emperor, towards the nation.
So it was both lived history and something that was actively reshaped later on.
Precisely. A historical phenomenon that was both lived and then consciously molded.
And even the timeline of when Bushido really emerged is up for debate.
Oh, absolutely. Some historians trace ideas back to the Kamakura period, late 12th century.
But others argue the actual term Bushido wasn't common until much later.
Right, maybe the Edo period, or even as late as the Meiji era. And then you have Notobi Inazu's book in the early 20th century.
Bushido, the soul of Japan.
Exactly. That popularization definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole story.
Which brings up a crucial point about how we even approach this topic.
We can't just accept it at face value, this idea of a single ancient code.
We need to look at the historiography.
Yes. How has the story of Bushido been told? And why? By whom? It's essential, right from the start, to acknowledge this ongoing scholarly debate about its authenticity and how it evolved.
Okay, so let's dive into the core of it then. The fundamental tenets, the philosophical ideas that underpin this way of the warrior.
Right. Because despite all the historical variations, certain core virtues keep showing up.
These were the guiding principles for samurai.
Pretty much. Now, the specific list, the emphasis, that might change depending on the source or the time period, but you consistently find virtues like
Ki, that's rectitude, justice.
Yeah, moral correctness. Acting rightly just because it is right. Upholding high ethical standards, often seen as the cornerstone, really.
Okay. Then there's you, courage.
You or Yuki. And not just about not being scared.
Right.
It's about acting righteously despite fear. Physical courage, sure, but also moral courage. Standing by your principles.
And it's linked to that composure, that acceptance of death, that famous saying.
The way of the samurai is found in death. Exactly. Speaks to that mindset.
And Jin, benevolence, mercy.
Compassion, yeah. For warriors wielding immense power, life and death power, this was considered, by some at least, a really high attribute. Kindness, empathy, especially towards those less powerful.
And after Jin.
Rei. Respect, politeness. But this goes deeper than just, surface etiquette.
How so?
It's about genuine regard for others, proper social conduct, yes, but also respect for hierarchy, even respect for your enemies, treating them, even their corpses, with a certain dignity.
Interesting. Next up is Makoto or Shin.
Honesty, sincerity, integrity. The idea here is absolute truthfulness. A samurai's word was their bond. Often, written contracts weren't even seen as necessary.
Because their word was the contract.
Exactly. And then, hugely important, meio. Honor or glory.
This feels central.
Oh, absolutely. A vivid consciousness of personal dignity, reputation, worth, valued often above life itself. The fear of disgrace, Haji, was incredibly powerful.
And maintaining honor wasn't just personal, was it?
No, it extended to the family, the clan. Preserving honor was crucial.
Which brings us back to seppuku.
Right. Ritual suicide. It wasn't just about dying. It was a codified way to avoid dishonor or to atone for failure, maybe even prove your sincerity. It's complex.
And closely tied to honor is chugi, or chu.
Loyalty,
Yeah.
duty. In the feudal context, this meant unwavering allegiance to your lord, your daimyo. Often this superseded even family ties.
And as you said, this later shifted towards the emperor and the state.
Yes, that's a key transformation.
Yeah.
And during the Edo period, you also get a really strong emphasis on giri, that sense of duty, social obligation, a broader concept than just loyalty to one lord.
Okay. And the last one on the list.
Jizei, self-control, discipline, adhering to the code, mastering your emotions, your actions, absolutely fundamental to samurai training in life, keeping composed under pressure.
So if you look at the big picture, it's that intense focus on loyalty, chugi, and honor, meio.
Often above life itself.
That really sets Bushido apart, doesn't it? Maybe compared to, say, Western chivalry.
I think so. While you find concepts of loyalty and honor elsewhere, the way seppuku became institutionalized, even glorified, that's a pretty critical divergence. It highlights a really unique cultural perspective on death and social standing.
Now, these virtues didn't just spring out of nowhere. They were deeply shaped by philosophical and religious traditions in Japan,
Precisely. You can't understand Bushido without looking at its roots. First, there's Zen Buddhism.
which became influential around the Kamakura period.
Yeah, it really gained traction then. Its emphasis on things like austerity, self-discipline, direct experience, mental toughness that resonated powerfully with warriors.
Makes sense.
Zen also cultivated calmness in the face of death, a kind of detachment. Concepts like mushin mind without mind and zanshin remaining mind.
Those were important in martial arts.
Crucial, promoting intuitive action, unwavering focus, even after the technique is finished. The key thing is how Zen's focus on the now, on detachment from fear, directly helped the samurai act decisively in combat. It wasn't just meditation, it was building a battlefield mindset.
Okay. Then we have Confucianism, particularly Neo-Confucianism.
Right. Which really rose to prominence during the long peace of the Edo period.
And how did that influence things?
Well, Confucianism emphasizes social harmony, order, hierarchy. This provided a perfect framework for the samurai's changing role. They weren't just warriors anymore, they were administrators, moral examples.
So it stressed virtues like loyalty, filial piety.
Righteousness, benevolence, jin, self-cultivation, education. The samurai were even kind of likened to the Confucian superior man, the ideal gentleman scholar.
And that's where giri, duty and obligation, became more prominent too.
Exactly. Think of chugi as that core loyalty to your lord, but giri is this wider web of duties to family, clan, society. It's a broader sense of social responsibility. Very Confucian.
And the third pillar, Shintoism.
Japan's indigenous religion. Shinto provided this really fundamental layer.
How so?
It instilled patriotism, reverence for ancestors,
Right.
and loyalty to the imperial line, which becomes super important later. Plus this connection to the land, nature, the divine, kami.
And ideas about purity, honor for the family line.
Yes, exactly. Maintaining honor for your ancestors. Even the term kamikaze, the divine wind, that supposedly saved Japan from the Mongols, that has Shinto roots.
So it wasn't just one thing, it was a blend.
Definitely. A syncretic process. Bushido adapted. In times of war, maybe Zen's influence was stronger.
And in peacetime, Confucian ethics provided structure for administration.
Right. And Shinto was always there, that underlying cultural bedrock of loyalty and reverence.
Okay, let's track this evolution more closely. How did Bushido manifest in feudal Japan, starting with the Kamakura period?
Right. Kamakura, late 12th to early 14th century. This is when the samurai really rise up from provincial warriors to establishing the first military government, the shogunate.
And a distinct warrior culture starts forming.
Yeah, solidifying. Emphasis on martial skill, stoicism, pride. Now, the actual word Bushido wasn't common yet, but the core ideas, they were definitely taking shape. Martial spirit, fearlessness, loyalty, honor, frugality, kindness, honesty.
And this is also when seppuku gets more established.
Yes, it becomes more institutionalized as this honorable way out to avoid capture or disgrace. And Zen Buddhism arriving around this time really fits in, providing that philosophical backing for discipline and accepting mortality.
The Mongol invasions must have played a role too.
Absolutely. Late 13th century. Facing that external threat really reinforced those samurai values. Loyalty, bravery, their crucial role in defending Japan.
Okay, then we shift gears into the Edo period, a long stretch of peace.
Yeah, early 17th to mid-19th century. And this piece really changes the samurai's job description.
From warrior to administrator.
Pretty much for any. bureaucrats, teachers, even artists within their lord's domains. And this is when Bushido thought gets more formalized, really absorbing Confucian ethics. The focus shifts towards duty, giri, social hierarchy, the samurai as these moral role models.
Obedience was key, but duty maybe even more so.
Often, yes, this sense of obligation was paramount.
And we start seeing actual texts appear, though maybe not all saying the same thing.
Exactly. Texts like the Kuju Kunkan, which does mention Bushido, writings from Yamaga Soko, who systematically laid out the samurai's role, equating them with that Confucian superior man.
And then you have things like Hagakure.
Right, Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure, much more radical, emphasizing this constant awareness of death, absolute loyalty, almost fanatically so.
It feels like a bit of a paradox, doesn't it? Codifying the warrior way when actual warfare was declining.
That's a really key insight. Was the need for this formalized code growing because their traditional role was fading, a way to maintain identity?
Possibly.
The Edo period also saw society become much more rigid. Samurai at the top, this closed caste, less than 10% of the population.
With clear privileges, like wearing two swords.
The daishush, the long katana, and the shorter wakizashi, a powerful symbol of their status. And they lived in castle towns, jukumachi.
So with fewer battles to fight, maybe these texts reaffirming their purpose, their moral superiority, became more important.
It seems likely. Cultivating this warrior sage ideal to justify their continued status. It's this gap, this tension between the ideal warrior and the reality of being a bureaucrat that really shapes how we see Edo samurai culture and why it got romanticized later.
So how did they actually live this code day to day?
Well, throughout the feudal era, they held immense power as vassals to their daimyo lords. They dominated government society.
And enjoyed those privileges we mentioned, the swords, special names.
Even the controversial right, kirisute gomen, to strike down commoners for disrespect. Though how often that was used and the ethics around it are complex.
And their training was broad, not just fighting.
Right. Martial arts like kendo, sure, but also academics, Chinese studies, poetry, plus spiritual discipline, often Zen. They were expected to be frugal, honest, even kind. Their appearance, their clothes were regulated too.
Engaged in refined arts as well, tea ceremony, calligraphy.
Yes, reflecting that warrior scholar ideal.
And we see the core tenets in action. Loyalty through service, sacrifice.
Absolutely. The story of the 47 Ronin is the classic, if perhaps idealized example of that extreme loyalty.
Honor maintained through conduct, fulfilling obligations.
And seppuku always there as the ultimate terrible guarantor of that honor. It shows how deeply these ideals were woven into their identity.
Okay, let's pivot now to this period of reinvention and decline, starting with Nitobe Inazu. His book seems crucial.
Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published around 1900, in English first. A really pivotal moment. It basically introduced Bushido to the West and hugely shaped how it was understood globally.
Why did he write it?
Nitobe had this very international background, Christian influences too. He partly wrote it to explain Japanese moral education to Westerners. This was the Meiji era, remember? Japan was modernizing rapidly, trying to gain recognition as a quote-unquote civilized nation.
So how did he frame Bushido for that audience?
He presented it as Japan's ethical foundation, outlined the core virtues, rectitude, courage, benevolence, politeness, honesty, honor, loyalty, self-control. Crucially, he drew parallels with Western ideas like chivalry, Christian morality, used Western allusions to make it relatable.
And emphasized the softer side, ethical, benevolent, polite.
Yeah, arguably downplaying the more militaristic aspects.
Right.
His goal seemed to be bridging East and West, linking Japan's past to its modern ambitions.
And it worked. The book was a success.
In the West, phenomenally successful, especially after Japan beat Russia in the war. Many Westerners suddenly pointed to Bushido's spirit, as described by Nitobe, as the reason. It really shaped perceptions for decades.
What about in Japan itself?
Slower reception initially, more muted, but eventually it did influence how some Japanese saw their own culture too.
But this portrayal didn't go unchallenged. This leads to the scholarly critiques.
Right. And the big one is the invention thesis.
The idea that Bushido as this coherent ancient code is, well, maybe not so ancient or coherent?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
That it was largely constructed or at least heavily shaped in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Historian Oleg Benesh, for example, tracked the usage of the word Bushido and found it was pretty rare before Meiji.
Others were even more critical.
Basil Hall Chamberlain, back in 1912, basically called it a fabrication for foreigners. So The argument isn't that samurai didn't have codes, but that this specific, unified idea of Bushido was created later.
For specific reasons, like nationalism.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
Critics say Nadabi romanticized things, maybe selectively interpreted history. His Christian background might have shaped it. Writing in English involved self-translation, maybe smoothing over rough edges.
And what about those earlier texts, like Hagakur?
Critics argue those represent specific, sometimes extreme viewpoints, not a universal code. There's even the accusation that later nationalist thinkers kind of back-engineered these texts, reading a Meiji-era ideology into them to give it historical legitimacy.
So this whole debate is tangled up with Japan's modernization and its relationship with the West.
Absolutely. That need to define a unique national identity in a time of huge change seems to be a key driver behind this invention, or at least reinvention, of Bushido.
Yeah.
It became a really useful narrative, a usable past.
And this is all happening as the Meiji Restoration unfolds.
Which was a massive upheaval, 1868. End of the shogunate, emperor restored, rapid modernization kicks off.
And a huge part of that was getting rid of the samurai class itself.
Exactly. Early 1870s, they lost their privileges. Swords, stipends, domains replaced by prefectures. A modern conscript army created.
It must have been a huge shock and identity crisis for them.
No doubt. Huge hardship, but many adapted. Used their education, skills, found roles in the new government, military, education.
But here's the paradox, right? The samurai class is gone, but Bushido, it survives.
It not only survives, it gets transformed and promoted.
How?
The Meiji government actively pushed core ideals: honor, discipline, self-sacrifice, and especially loyalty. But now loyalty was redirected.
To the emperor and the nation.
Precisely. Bushido became a pillar of national ethical training in schools, linked with state Shinto. It fostered nationalism, that martial spirit they felt they needed internationally.
So abolishing the samurai actually allowed their supposed code to become universalized.
In a strange way, yes. It became this national ideology, a tool for the Meiji state, applied to everyone, especially soldiers, to instill loyalty and obedience. Remember, Hagakur's extreme loyalty. The government latched onto that and aimed it at the emperor.
It's amazing how these ideas, debated and transformed as they are, still echo in contemporary Japan.
Absolutely. Despite everything the end of the samurai, the scholarly debates, you can still see the influence.
Like in the business world, the
Yeah.
corporate warrior idea.
Yeah, you can definitely see echoes, that demanding corporate culture. There's often still a strong expectation of loyalty, even if lifetime employment isn't the given it once was. Prioritizing the company, it mirrors that loyalty to a lord.
And things like respect, hierarchy.
Deeply embedded. You see it in seating arrangements, tsukiji, the whole ritual of exchanging business cards, meishikakan, seniority systems, even the famous work ethic, discipline, attention to quality, kaizen. You can link that back to samurai self-cultivation ideals.
But there's a downside to that intensity too.
Unfortunately, yes. That pressure for loyalty and self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's connected to serious problems like karoshi, death from overwork, and kurojisatsu, suicide from overwork. It shows how these old virtues can get really distorted in a modern capitalist setting.
Things are changing though, slowly.
There's more awareness, yeah. A gradual shift towards flexibility, mental health focus. But those traditional expectations still carry a lot of weight.
What about education? Any legacy there?
Well, traditional samurai education wasn't just about fighting, it was about character building. Jukaku Kaisei. Influenced by Confucianism, thinkers like Yamagusoku.
And that carried over.
Into the modern system after Meiji, yes. Now, the overt pre-war Bushido indoctrination is gone, obviously. But moral education, Dutoku, still emphasizes character, discipline, respect, self-control, diligence, group cooperation. The school system is a key way these norms get passed down, even if nobody explicitly says Bushido much anymore.
Though maybe less so with younger generations.
Possibly. They face different pressures, different influences. It's an ongoing evolution.
And these principles seem to seep into everyday social interactions too.
Definitely. That emphasis on group harmony, well, you see it in consensus building, indirect communication.
Respect-rei in bowing, honorific language, kaigo.
Right. And the importance of duty, social obligation, giri,
Yeah.
in relationships. It's all tied to maintaining honor, meiyo, reputation.
Saving face.
Exactly. Avoiding shame, Haji. It's a powerful motivator for conforming to expectations. Again, echoes of Bushido's focus on honor.
Which can be good for stability, but maybe stifle individuality sometimes.
That's the potential downside, yeah.
Yeah.
Pressure to conform can sometimes limit expression or critical thinking.
And of course, the martial arts. Budo.
A direct lineage there. Kendo, judo, aikido, karate. The "duch" suffix itself means the way, implying self-cultivation beyond just fighting skill.
So practitioners are expected to cultivate those virtues: discipline, respect.
Self-control, perseverance, honesty, honor. Yes. Zen concepts like Mushin, Zanshin are still relevant in training. Judo's principle of GDQA, mutual welfare, echoes benevolence, Jin.
Though historically, some arts were tied to nationalism.
They were. But the key distinction is that modern Budo has mostly shifted focus from warfare and feudal loyalty to personal development, spiritual growth, fitness. It's an adaptation, preserving ethical cores, but detaching them from the old socio-political duties.
Though critiques still exist about loyalty demands within organizations.
Sure, those issues can arise in any hierarchical structure, including modern martial arts groups.
Finally, Bushido and the samurai are huge in popular culture.
Absolutely massive.
Yeah.
Films, anime, manga, books, often romanticized, sometimes pretty far from historical fact.
And that romanticization has roots back in the Meiji era's nation-building efforts.
Definitely. Those ideals, discipline, perseverance, loyalty, honor, stoicism, often get presented as core parts of the Japanese national character, Yamato Damashi, historically used to promote pride, mobilization.
But it's complicated now post-war.
Very. That association with wartime aggression led to a lot of rejection and ambivalence. So invoking Bushido in relation to, say, Japan's self-defense forces today is still a very sensitive topic.
So wrapping it up.
In conclusion, despite all the complexities, the debates, these principles continue to pop up in discussions about ethics, leadership, Japanese identity, often presented as timeless wisdom.
Even if the history is more tangled.
Right. The enduring appeal, even with inaccuracies, might fulfill some need for clear morals, national distinctiveness, connection to a heroic past. Who knows?
So bringing it all together then, Bushido started as warrior ideals, became more formalized, got shaped by different philosophies.
Zen, Confucianism, Shinto.
Then the Meiji Restoration transformed it from a samurai-specific code into this national ideology.
And while its authenticity as some single ancient code is debated, you can't deny its impact on modern Japan. Business, education, social life, martial arts, it's there.
Yeah, that core tension we talked about, historical reality versus constructed ideology, really highlights how interpretation and reinvention work over time.
Exactly. It's a constant process.
And looking forward, while those virtues might still resonate, we need to be careful, right? Apply them with nuance, context, avoid the dangers like blind obedience.
For sure. You can't just pluck these ideas out of history without understanding their baggage. Ultimately, Bushido is this complex, contested part of Japan's cultural heritage.
Reflecting that constant interplay between tradition and modernity, fact and myth.
Yeah. Studying it tells us a lot about Japanese history and values, but also about how traditions everywhere get formed, changed, reinterpreted.
That's a really insightful way to frame it. And maybe final thought for everyone listening.
Go for it.
Consider how your own understanding of things like honor, loyalty, duty, how are those ideas shaped by the historical, the cultural stories you encounter? And how might those stories themselves change or be reinterpreted in the future? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.